Our first speaker today is a highly educated man, highly motivated. He's an Oxford graduate, a former artillery officer, a teacher and Nationalist election candidate. He is an inveterate letter writer. You may have come across the book, Am I Alone in Thinking? Unpublished letters to the Daily Telegraph and other such papers. Well, his letter, a 24-page letter to the Chief of Police of North Wales, is an underground classic, but wasn't in that book for some reason. Anyway, without further ado, please put your hands together and give a very warm welcome to Ian Fotheringham.
Jez Turner, ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to be here, and I thank Jez Turner for that introduction, which I think is over the top, really.
Consonants.
Now, some of it's true. One of the things I believe is that the English elocution, the way we speak, has deteriorated savagely in the last 70 years. Yeah. If I see a film on television like In Which We Serve, or The Dam Busters, or something that was produced about 70 years ago, I know I don't have to switch the subtitles on. But if it's been produced in the last 20 or 30 years, I'm afraid without the subtitles I wouldn't find it worth watching, because I would have no idea what they're saying. What I'm saying really at this point is that if any of you cannot hear what I'm saying at the back or anywhere, please put your hands up and I will adjust my tone accordingly. Right. Well, I'm not a political activist these days, but I do have a sensitivity every so often to the sheer ignorance, shallow-mindedness, and general ineptness of the ruling classes, and something or other occasionally triggers something off in me, and I write a letter. That is a form of relief. I spent a couple of days putting it on paper. It's not a 3-line letter. It's not disgusted Tunbridge Wells. It's a kind of reply or attack on the attitude they have evinced. And although we're talking about the Anglo-Saxons, and Jez has mentioned my letters, I thought I would start and warm myself up and warm you all up by reading you a recent one. It's only a 3-page letter, not a 24-page one. It should be here somewhere. Oh, yes. This letter was caused, as it says indeed, in the first paragraph or so, by the inane attitude of a chap named Matthew Hancock, who is a Conservative MP. Without more ado, I shall read it. It's dated the 25th of June this year. Dear Mr. Hancock, I'm sure you will recall participating as a commentator on the BBC panel on the evening of 5th June on the outcome of the Newark by-election. Your comments were germane to the discussion, but I was perturbed by one remark you made on the subject of immigration. Someone pointed out that much of the recent immigration to this country had been from Eastern Europe. Thereupon you remarked that since these immigrants would have been white, no racial issue arose. The implication is that you consider race and colour to be synonymous, that white people are of one race and coloured people another. Perhaps it ought to be like that, but the fact is that such a simplistic dichotomy is a wildly perverse distortion of reality. Europe has many white or depigmentized races. If it were not so, the title of Kuhn's seminal 1939 book, The Races of Europe, would presumably have been the European race. Coloured immigration into Europe was infinitesimal before the Second World War. Kuhn's races were all white. It was W.Z. Ripley who in 1899 published his book on the races of Europe, which starkly categorized them into 3 broad categories: Teutonic, Alpine and Mediterranean. Between that date and about 1950, anthropologists considerably expanded this categorization based upon genetic studies well beyond the data available to Ripley, whose material was mainly skeletal. Thus we have dinarics, armenoids, borobu, dallophalid, and goodness knows how many others. at least half a dozen. These different types of men make up, in various proportions, the white inhabitants of the present nations of Europe. The Danes, for example, are 40% Borrebo, and only 20% Hallstatt Nordic, the classical Nordic type. It is interesting that genetically similar races, such as the Mediterraneans and the Berbers, and the Armenians and the Iranians, actually span the colour divide, the first of each pair being white and the second being among those classified as coloured, even though they are only moderately so. It is not surprising that even an Exeter, I looked up on Google, he was at Exeter College, Oxford, it is not surprising that even an Exeter man should be uninformed about these matters. Since the last war, there's been a taboo over any discussion of race or racism in the Western world, seemingly because of a vulgar logical error. Hitler was a racist. Hitler was a bad man. Therefore racism is bad. This is one of the many invalid forms of the syllogism. All fishes can swim, Mr. Churchill could swim, therefore Mr. Churchill is a fish, is how I call to mind this particular invalid form. Only a very few brave academics, such as Jensen, Baker and Kuhn, have dared to infringe this taboo overtly. In general, suppression and distortion and a very inappropriate level of shrill and vituperative comment from partisan academic voices have fouled the waters and frightened politicians in particular. But it is important that we English should recognise the realities of race, and I will tell you why. I'm telling him, not you, but I'm telling you as well. One of the oldest sayings, possibly 1500 years old, of our Frisian ancestors was "Liever dod als Slave," sooner dead than a slave. Have you ever asked yourself, Mr. Hancock, why the word for slave and slave are the same in English, Danish, Dutch, Swedish? It is because our ancestors recognised a particular inherent quality in the Eastern Europeans which they did not favour. The Slavs are, for want of a better word, collectivists. Their idea of freedom is not ours. Let's start with ourselves. The Englishman and his close relatives take an individual view. Freedom is the right not to follow the pack, but to oppose or ignore the pack, to say, do and believe things which run counter to the spirit of the times or the occasion, to not be part of any grouping that he has not joined voluntarily. He is not a social animal, nor compared with the generality of mankind are his family ties strong. Historically, the Northwest Europeans had a seafaring culture, and sailors do not live in societies. They have shipmates, and their association ends when they drop anchor in a home port. Even if they're landlubbers, they are not social, but form or join clubs to associate with those of their compatriots who are like-minded. The English are by their nature defiant and obstinate. They dislike and fear the powerful who threaten their individualism, and so they combine ad hoc to pull down over mighty subjects. So much is disagreement, and in consequence the right to oppose, a part of their culture, that their legal system is adversarial, not inquisitorial, and they pay the leader of the opposition in Parliament for opposing. It used to be impossible to coerce any Northwest European, because his fear of living with himself as a nidderer, if he allowed himself to be coerced for fear of death, was greater than the fear of death itself. No one can persuade me by force whilst I have strength to stand and use my weapons, said the Icelander in the year 995, when threatened by the King of Norway for refusing to accept Christian baptism. In England, Thomas More on the one hand, and Fox's Protestant martyrs on the other, preferred to die rather than yield. Our national folklore hero is an outlaw and a rebel. In total contrast to this man is the Easterner. His genes tell him that freedom is a collective freedom, the freedom of the tribe, freedom for his society, not freedom from it. They also tell him that he as an individual counts for little. Accuse him of a crime, even if he is innocent, as many were of those accused and executed in the Stalin treason trials just before the war, and his instinct is to be submissive and resigned, even to feel and to plead guilty. The accusation in itself puts him at odds with that which he holds dear, the tribe, and induces a Kafkaesque sense of guilt. But lay your hands on the beehive, on Holy Mother Russia, And as he showed in the Great Patriotic War, he will fight like a tiger, for now you have touched him where he does feel it. And as he fights, the word freedom will be constantly on his lips. Stalin's freedom, the freedom to belong and to obey. This is the mentality of the Slav, whether Russian, Wendish, Polish, Czech or Serbian. He's passionately patriotic. He will immerse himself in a common national cause. He is very brave and formidable when the drum sounds. The Northwesterner, by contrast, takes a personal view even of a national cause. He has to be convinced that it is in his interest to participate. Loyalty he could understand and practice, says Wingfield Stratford of the Anglo-Saxon, but it had to be freely given and for adequate reasons. In the American War of Independence, those conditions did not exist, because a substantial minority, perhaps even a majority of our people, were sympathetic to the revolutionary cause. Were not the colonists fighting for British freedoms? Consequently, the British were obliged to fight and lose that war with hired Hessian mercenaries. There must be a gene, or genes, for self-reliance and personal independence of thought and action, which the Northwesterners possess and the Slavs do not. And it is the reason for our institutions. If you cannot coerce men, because they will not be coerced, but you nevertheless need their cooperation and assistance to fight off an invader or to man a Viking ship, you have to persuade or possibly to buy their collaboration by offering them something. The stick does not work, so it has to be the carrot. Perhaps they have to be persuaded that by helping you, they will be helping themselves. The arts of persuasion, laws and lawmen, contracts and their enforcement, trust and the ability to distinguish between the trustworthy and the untrustworthy come into being. Sophisticated precedents and shadowy constitutions begin to emerge. These growths took place in all Germanic societies, not just in England. David Cameron is hunting around for the elusive British or English values. What he quotes are effects, not causes. He should examine the roots and then he would understand. King Alfred understood. He said that he was fettered in his efforts to organise the Saxons of Wessex to fight off the Danish invaders because he was king of a free people. He nevertheless prevailed to become our Alfred the Great. J.S. Mill and other Victorians have told us what the English spirit is all about, but we no longer find it respectable to remember what they said, and we have been brainwashed to ignore it. It depends on a commonality of ethical and other values in a basically class-based Germanic society based on racial homogeneity. Honesty, conscience and fair dealing were inherent, together with dislike of the powerful, checks and balances and a dispersion of power. Class was necessary to provide a corpus of leaders available as rallying points if the central power tended towards undue dominance or tyranny. Social bonds were weak and non-tribal, but when combination was required for a purpose, the Englishman recognised his fellows. Anglo-Saxon notables would recruit their housecarls, warriors, from local men, but also from Saxons or Danes who came from distant parts, but were fellow Germans in the widest sense. They were bought with cakes and ale and gold rings on their arms for particular feats in battle. They were mercenaries, whose loyalty could be bought, as all free people are mercenaries, e.g. Swiss, Germans. But having contracted and given their word and their hand clasp, they will be faithful unto death. One has to point out that these characteristics of dispassionate honesty which enabled compurgation or trial by the sworn oaths of those who knew the accused to be practical in the Anglo-Saxon parts of England did not extend to the British Isles as a whole. Trial by jury was introduced in Wales in the 14th century, but had to be abandoned because Welsh jurymen were found unable to be impartial. And Walter Scott tells us that a Scottish judge in the early 18th century reproved for partiality by being reminded of the rectitude shown by the English judges whom Cromwell had appointed to accompany the Scottish judges on their circuits, composedly answered, "Devil thank them for their impartiality, a pack of kinless loons. For my part, I can never see a cousin or friend in the wrong." Our institutions arise from the nature of our people, not from the Enlightenment, except insofar as that process arose from the same source. Milton, Locke, Pym and Hampden were Englishmen to their backbone, as were George Washington, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. I happen to like the Poles, who are brave and worthy people, and other Eastern Europeans may well be also. Their merits or demerits are not the issue. To admit into this country 1, 2, 3 million Poles is not only to dilute the character from which our institutions emerge, but to confront it. Finally, you and all the other politicians who have betrayed this country from sheer shallowness of understanding, especially the Tories, who should have known better, hear Benjamin Disraeli. You have an ancient, powerful, richly endowed church and perfect religious liberty. You have unbroken order and complete freedom. You have landed estates as large as the Romans, combined with commercial enterprises such as Carthage and Venice, united, never equalled. And you must remember, this peculiar country, with these strong contrasts, is not governed by force, it's not governed by standing armies, it's governed by a most singular series of traditionary influences, which generation after generation cherishes, because it knows that they embalm custom and represent law. And these mighty creations are out of all proportion to the essential and indigenous elements and resources of the country. If you destroy that state of society, remember this: England cannot begin again. Well, so much for my letter. Strange to say, the man didn't reply.